So we're diving deep today into harm. It's something we all kind of come across, but rarely, I think, really try to define.
Yeah,
It's like almost like grabbing at smoke. Like you think you have it, but it slips right through your fingers.
it does. It does.
But you've sent in some research that tries to pin down this, I guess, elusive concept, particularly from a causal analysis of harm
Yes.
from the journal Minds and Machines.
Yes, a fascinating paper.
Oh, it looks fascinating.
Yeah, it really tackles a core issue that we have. I mean, even the European Commission's wrestling with defining harm in their AI regulations.
Oh, wow.
So, it's something that we need to get a good grasp of.
Absolutely.
It's a pretty fundamental concept.
It is. And this paper isn't shying away from the challenge. It jumps right in with, I think, a quote. It quotes a philosopher who calls harm a Frankensteinian jumble.
Right, right.
Not exactly a confidence booster.
Yeah.
We're going to unpack a concept that stumped thinkers for ages. And maybe, just maybe, we'll come out with a clearer understanding.
Yeah. I mean, I think the paper does a great job of going through all the ways people have tried to define harm in the past. Some of the traditional approaches, the causal account, the counterfactual comparative account,
Wow, yeah.
even the contrastive causal counterfactual account. But they kind of all have limitations.
It's like trying to, fit a square peg in a round hole. It just doesn't
Yeah.
quite work.
Exactly. Yeah.
But this paper proposes a new tool for the job, I guess.
Right.
Causal models.
Yeah.
Now, I know what you might be thinking.
Yeah.
Causal models sounds complicated, but
Yeah.
trust me, they're not as intimidating as they seem. I'm learning that as we go.
Exactly. And I think, the best way to think of a causal model is like a map, but instead of showing streets and landmarks, it shows how different things in the world are connected and influence each other.
Oh,
You have variables which represent different factors, values, which are the different states those factors can take,
okay.
and then equations that link them all together.
So it's like a set of if this, then that statements, but just way more sophisticated.
Exactly.
Way more sophisticated. But how do we use these causal models to define harm?
Yeah, I think the key is to incorporate the idea of utility into our causal model.
Okay.
Right. So utility is a measure of how good or bad something is. So in our model, we assign a utility value to each possible outcome.
So we're not just looking at what happens, but also how good or bad those happenings are.
Exactly.
Okay, that makes sense. But how do we decide what counts as good or bad? I mean, that seems pretty subjective, doesn't it?
Right. It is subjective, but that's where the concept of default utility comes in.
Okay.
So the default utility represents the baseline level of well-being that we're comparing things to. So it's kind of like a reference point.
So it's not just about whether something made things better or worse overall. It's about whether it made things better or worse than they would have been otherwise.
Exactly.
Okay. I'm starting to see how this adds a whole new layer of nuance to defining harm.
Yeah. And it also, this kind of nuanced approach is what allows us to distinguish between just harm and strict harm.
Oh, okay.
So harm occurs when the outcome of an event has a lower utility than the default utility.
Okay.
Strict harm occurs when the outcome is not only worse than the default, but also worse than any alternative event.
So harm is like saying, this made things worse than they should have been.
Yeah.
And strict harm is like saying, this made things worse and there was no way to avoid it.
Yeah.
Okay, that distinction seems really important.
Exactly.
Especially when we're talking about things like accidents or unintended consequences,
Yeah, absolutely. And the paper goes through a really, I think, an interesting series of examples to kind of illustrate how this definition of harm combined with these causal models can actually help us make sense of some really tricky situations.
And I think those examples are going to be really helpful to solidify all of this for our listeners. Are you ready to dive into those?
Yeah, let's see what this new definition can do.
Okay, great. Let's start with a scenario that's ripped from the headlines. Or at least it could be soon.
Okay.
Imagine Batman's cruising along in a self-driving car.
Ah, the autonomous car dilemma. A classic.
Right.
It's a perfect example of how new technologies are forcing us to grapple with these age-old questions about harm in new ways.
Exactly. So the car is equipped with all the latest safety features, sensors, algorithms.
Right.
It's designed to protect its occupants at all costs. But then the unthinkable happens. The car encounters a situation where a collision is imminent.
And now the car has a split-second decision to make.
Uh-oh.
It could swerve to avoid the collision, but that would mean putting, Batman, the passenger, at risk.
Yeah.
Or it could stay on course and minimize the risk to Batman, but potentially resulting in a more severe collision overall.
Talk about a moral quandary. What happens next?
In this scenario, let's say the car decides to swerve.
Okay.
It ends up injuring Batman in the process,
Okay.
but potentially avoiding this, worse outcome. Right.
So now the question is, did the car harm Batman? On the surface, it seems like it did. I mean, he was injured.
Right.
But the car was also trying to protect him, right?
Yeah, and this is where I think this new definition of harm, powered by causal models, really comes into play.
Okay.
So to figure out if the car harmed Batman, we need to consider the default utility, the baseline level of well-being we're comparing things to.
Okay.
So in this case, the default utility would be Batman not being injured.
Okay.
Right. So compared to that baseline, yes, the car's actions did result in harm.
Yeah.
But the paper points out, though, is that different stakeholders might have different perspectives on what counts as the default utility.
Oh. So they might come to different conclusions about whether harm occurred or not.
Exactly. So from Batman's perspective, he definitely experienced harm.
Yeah, for sure.
He got in the car expecting a safe ride, not a trip to the emergency room.
Yeah, right.
Right. But from the car manufacturer's perspective, they could argue that their car actually prevented a worse outcome, a major collision that could have resulted in even more severe injuries or even death.
Oh, wow.
Right. So it really depends on whose perspective you're taking and what you're considering to be the default utility.
So who's right? Is it harm or not?
Well, that's the beauty of this framework, right?
Yeah.
It doesn't try to give this simple yes or no answer.
Right.
Instead, it forces us to really consider the different perspectives, the underlying assumptions about what constitutes harm.
Absolutely. But wait, there's another twist.
Right.
What if Batman claims that if he had been alerted to the impending collision, he could have taken evasive action and avoided the accident altogether?
Right. And then that raises a really interesting question, which is, whose causal model are we using here?
Oh.
Batman's or the manufacturer's. If we factor in Batman's claim and we adjust the causal model accordingly, the conclusion about harm might shift yet again.
Wow. This is getting so complicated.
Yeah.
Even a seemingly straightforward situation. A car swerving to avoid an accident can turn into like this philosophical puzzle when we start really digging into the concept of harm.
Exactly. And it highlights just how important it is to be really deliberate and thoughtful about the choices that we make when we're constructing causal models.
Yeah.
These assumptions that we make about the default utility, the possible outcomes, even the relationships between the events, they can all have a significant impact on, our conclusions about whether harm occurred.
I'm starting to see how this all fits together, but I have a feeling we've only just scratched the surface here.
Yeah.
We have a lot more to explore. Okay, so we've seen how this framework can handle these tricky situations with, an autonomous car swerving to avoid an accident. But this paper goes even further, and it explores scenarios that really stretch our understanding of cause and effect. And for this next one, we're going back to our old friend, Batman.
Yes. This is a classic thought experiment in the philosophy of harm.
Oh, okay.
It deals with the problem of what we call preemption.
Okay.
Might seem a little morbid,
Right.
but it really helps illustrate, I think, a key point.
All right, hit me with it. What happened to Batman this time?
So picture this. Batman standing on a rooftop, unaware of the danger lurking around the corner. Suddenly he collapses, clutching his chest, a massive heart attack. Tragically, he dies instantly. But here's the catch. Just a split second after his heart gives out, a flaming cannonball, fired by some unknown villain, comes hurtling towards him, striking the exact spot where he lay.
Okay, wow, that's dramatic.
Right.
But I have to ask, did the heart attack actually harm Batman in this scenario? Right.
I mean, he was already gone when the cannonball hit.
Right.
Didn't the heart attack kind of save him from, a more fiery demise?
Well, that's a very natural way to think about it, I think.
Yeah.
And it's precisely where the traditional, what we call counterfactual accounts of harm, really run into trouble.
Okay.
Because they focus solely on comparing outcomes.
Okay.
So Batman dead by heart attack versus Batman obliterated by a cannonball. And conclude that, well, the heart attack didn't really make a difference.
Yeah.
He was going to die anyway.
But that feels wrong, doesn't it?
Right.
It seems like the heart attack should still be considered harmful, even though the cannonball was, a close second. It's like saying, if you die peacefully in your sleep at 99, you didn't experience harm because you were going to die eventually anyway.
Right.
That doesn't, sit right.
Exactly. And this is where I think the power of these causal models combined with this concept of default utility really shines through.
Right. Because instead of just looking at the final outcome, we can actually break down the events into their individual causal contributions.
So it's like we're zooming in on the timeline and saying, hold on a second, even though the cannonball was about to hit, the heart attack was the actual cause of death in this specific instance.
Exactly.
Okay.
And we can represent this in our causal model by introducing variables like death by heart attack and death by cannonball. And this allows us to see that the heart attack did, in fact, cause a specific harm, which is death by heart attack, even though, the ultimate outcome might have been the same in both scenarios.
So it's not just about the final state, but about the specific events that led to that state?
Exactly.
Okay, that makes so much more sense. But how does the concept of default utility apply here?
Well, I think, in this case, we would all agree that the default utility for Batman is being alive. Right. And since the heart attack caused an outcome, death, which is a lower utility than the default, we can confidently say that the heart attack was indeed harmful.
Right, okay.
Regardless of the impending cannonball.
Wow, that's really elegant. It really, I feel like it captures the intuitive sense that the heart attack was harmful, even though it was preempted by another fatal event. Causal models are really proving their worth.
They certainly are a powerful tool, I think, for really dissecting these complex scenarios.
Okay, so we've seen how this new framework can handle cases of preemption. What other tricky situations can it help us untangle?
Well, another challenge in defining harm is distinguishing it from merely failing to benefit someone.
Okay.
And Batman, being the brooding hero that he is, often finds himself in these kinds of dilemmas.
Oh, I have a feeling this is going to be good. Give me the details.
Okay, so imagine this. Batman has a brand new set of custom-made golf clubs.
Of course, Batman and golf. What could be more natural?
Right. So, and he's considering giving these clubs to Robin, his trusty sidekick. Robin, being a, young and enthusiastic golfer, would be absolutely thrilled to receive such a gift.
Yeah.
But in a moment of Batman-like introspection, he decides to keep the clubs for himself.
Aw, come on, Batman. That's just mean.
Well, it might seem a bit selfish.
Yeah.
But the question is, did Batman actually harm Robin by not giving him the clubs?
He definitely didn't benefit Robin, but calling it harm seems a bit extreme. It's more like a missed opportunity, right?
Exactly. And this is where the traditional counterfactual accounts might kind of lead us astray.
Okay.
Because they might compare Robin's actual state, which is not having the golf clubs, to a hypothetical state where he did receive the clubs, and conclude that Batman's actions were harmful because Robin is worse off than he could have been.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So how does this new definition with its fancy causal models and a default utility help us make a more, I guess, sensible judgment?
Well, I think by forcing us to ask what level of well-being is Robin actually entitled to in this situation.
Okay.
Did he have, a legitimate expectation of receiving those golf clubs?
I see what you're getting at. If Robin had no reason to believe that he was getting those golf clubs, then Batman not giving them to him isn't really harming him. He's just staying at his, baseline level of well-being.
Exactly. In this case, the default utility is simply Robin's current state, which is not having the golf clubs. And since Batman's action didn't actually cause Robin's utility to drop below that default, our definition would say, no, there's no harm here,
Okay.
It was just a missed opportunity for a benefit, as you said.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. But what if the situation was different? Like, what if Batman had promised Robin the golf clubs?
Right.
Or what if it was a long-standing tradition for Batman to give Robin a new set of clubs every year?
Right. Now you're getting it.
Yeah.
In those cases, the default utility would shift.
Right.
Right? Because now Robin has a legitimate expectation of receiving those clubs, and Batman withholding them, yeah, that would be considered harmful.
So it's not just about the action itself, like giving or not giving the golf clubs. It's about the context, the expectations, and how that shapes the default utility.
You've hit the nail on the head. The default utility is doing a lot of the heavy lifting I think, in this definition of harm.
Yeah.
You know, it allows us to move beyond just this purely objective analysis of outcomes
Yeah.
and really consider the subjective expectations, the entitlements of the individuals involved.
This is fascinating. It's like we're adding a layer of like moral and social context to our understanding of harm.
Exactly. And we can apply the same logic, I think, to all sorts of different situations.
Okay.
Think about tipping at a restaurant.
Okay.
In some cultures, it's just expected. Not tipping would be considered extremely rude, harmful.
Yeah.
In other cultures, it's not really expected.
Mhm.
And not tipping wouldn't really be considered harmful.
Right, right.
So the action is the same, but the context, and therefore the default utility, is different.
Wow, I'm starting to see just how powerful this framework is.
Mhm.
It can handle preemption problems. It can distinguish harm from failing to benefit. It can account for subjective expectations. But I have a feeling we're not done yet. The paper dives into even more complicated scenarios.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
We've only just begun to explore, I think, the depths of this new definition of harm.
Oh, okay.
There's so much more to uncover.
Yeah. Okay, so we've explored how this new definition of harm based on causal models and default utility can really help us understand some of these super tricky situations. We've talked about preemption, the difference between harm and like failing to benefit somebody. We've looked at multiple contrasts, and we even dove into that whole idea of strict harm. And I think we've seen pretty clearly that this framework, it gives us a way more nuanced and objective way to assess harm than some of the other approaches out there, like that one from RBT that we talked about. But before we wrap up this deep dive, I think there's one more super crucial aspect of this paper that we need to explore, and that's this whole idea of a quantitative approach to harm.
You're absolutely right. We've been mainly focusing on a qualitative understanding of harm. Did it happen or not? But the authors of this paper, they go a step further. They're actually developing a way to quantify harm to say not just did it occur, but how much harm occurred.
I gotta admit, this is kind of blowing my mind. It's like we're taking our harmometer and we're slapping numbers on it, but how do you even start to measure something as complex and multifaceted as harm? Like, where do you even begin?
It's definitely a huge challenge. It involves assigning like numerical values to utilities,
Mm.
taking into account things like how severe the harm was, how long it lasted, and how many people were affected. Think of it this way. If we can assign a number to something like happiness,
Yeah.
which is also subjective and complex, we can use similar logic for harm.
So instead of just saying yes or no to harm, we could say this action caused this much harm and that action caused this much harm.
Exactly. And that kind of precise quantitative language could be incredibly valuable for policymakers, regulators, and industry leaders.
Mm.
People have to make tough decisions where they need to balance risks and benefits.
That makes a lot of sense. Instead of just saying this technology is dangerous, we could say this technology has a specific risk of causing this much harm, so we need to implement these safety measures.
Exactly. And it's not just limited to physical harm. We can apply this to things like economic harm, social harm, or even psychological harm.
It feels like we're moving towards a more data-driven, evidence-based way of understanding and addressing harm. But I have to imagine there are ethical considerations too, right? When you start trying to quantify something as complex as harm.
You're absolutely right. Anytime we're dealing with sensitive decisions that could really impact people's lives, we have to be super careful about how we use data and
Yeah.
interpret it. We got to be mindful of bias errors, unintended consequences, and make sure that our quantitative models actually align with our values and ethical principles.
It's a good reminder that even the most sophisticated models and algorithms are only as good as the data we use to train them and the values we embed in them.
I think the biggest takeaway for our listeners is this: defining and understanding harm is way more complex than it might seem at first glance. Our old ways of thinking about it, they just don't cut it anymore,
Mm.
especially in a world that's so shaped by technology complex systems. All this interconnectedness, this new framework, it gives us a more powerful, more nuanced, and potentially even quantifiable way to analyze harm. And it takes into account not just the outcomes, but the intentions, the expectations, that whole intricate web of cause and effect that shapes our world.
I couldn't have said it better myself, but before we go, I think it's worth leaving our listeners with one final thought. We've been talking about harm to individuals, but what about harm to groups or communities or even to the environment as a whole?
That's a great question. How do we apply this framework to those larger scale harms? How do we determine default utilities for a whole community or an entire ecosystem?